Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Morton Blackwell, president of the Leadership Institute. It is my pleasure. Is this thing on? Can you hear? Is it being amplified in the back? I don't think so. Somebody give us a little more volume here. Okay, thank you. Good morning. I'm Morton Blackwell, president of the Leadership Institute. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the March Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast here at the Leadership Institute. We have a fine program for you this morning, which I know you will enjoy and learn from. We live in interesting times. This morning's Washington Times has a front page story about a young fellow named Nathan Chapman. I don't know if you happen to see that story about young Mr. Chapman. He was one of those, the paper says, who made the arduous journey to Iraq last week, intending to help impoverished civilians and defend orphanages against the U.S.-led bombing, etc., etc. However, the paper says by yesterday afternoon he was back in Amman, Jordan, convinced that his sacrifice would amount to nothing in Baghdad. Quote, "No humanitarian sites were made available to us," said Mr. Chapman, a delicate 20-year-old Englishman who sold everything he had to make the trip to Iraq. Quote, "It was clear they wouldn't be." He's one of an estimated 200 or more Americans, Canadians, Australians, and Europeans who went to Baghdad to offer themselves up as human shields, prepared to defend civil and humanitarian structures with their lives. About half of those have already left the country in frustration, angered that the Iraqi government demanded they leave low-risk targets such as hospitals and instead cluster around electrical plants, water pumping stations, and communication centers. On Friday, the head of Sweden's largest police organization, which was urging human shields, urged their people to leave, saying they were, quote, being used for propaganda purposes by Saddam Hussein. We really do live in interesting times. As my father would say, what do you expect from a pig but a grunt? In 2003 to date, the Leadership Institute has trained 700 students at 24 schools, and we have placed 10 job seekers through our free employment placement program this year. You have before you at your seats our 2003 school schedule. I ask that you take a moment now to review that calendar and consider attending one of our programs later this year, or recommend those programs to others who would benefit from them. Now my pleasure to introduce Dan Klink, who will offer an invocation and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Dan joined the staff here at the Institute as a schools recruiter in the fall of 1997. In 1998, he served as programs administrator, where his primary responsibility included coordinating the schools and working with the Leadership Institute faculty. Dan currently serves as the director of programs, overseeing various aspects of Leadership Institute schools and special programs conducted in the F.M. Kirby National Training Center on our third floor. Originally from California, and by the way, Dan, I was there, as you know, all of last week. The high temperatures range from 61 to 65 degrees all of last week in Southern California, where I was working hard for the Institute, I promise. He's a graduate of Miami University, Ohio, with a BA degree in political science. Dan Klink.
Good morning. Let us bow our heads in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this new day and the opportunity to meet this morning. We thank you for this great land and the freedom you have so richly blessed us with. Lord, we confess that we have not always loved you with our whole hearts. Remind us of the cross on which your Son bore the guilt of our sin, and remind us of his resurrection by which he gained for us the freedom to live. Lord, give the leaders of this great nation wisdom and discernment. Strengthen and protect those who are willing to pay the ultimate sacrifice. We ask, Lord, that you go before them and remind them that though the horse is prepared for the day of battle, ultimate victory is in your hands. We humbly ask now, Lord, that you bless this food we are about to eat. Bless Mr. Eastland as he speaks, and bless the fellowship we will enjoy with good friends. But above all, Lord, may we continue to grow in the grace and knowledge of your Son, Jesus Christ, from whom all blessings flow. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. If you'll all recite with me now the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thanks, Dan. I couldn't help but notice that we all said "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance, and unless something happens, this is going to be illegal, at least in public environs. I guess on March the 10th, in the states in the Ninth Circuit. I remember, I'm one of those in the room old enough to remember in the early 1950s during the Eisenhower administration when the word "under God" was added to the pledge. I hope I don't experience it being yanked. Now it's my pleasure to present to you Manny Espinoza. He's going to give us an update on the campus leadership program. Manny's been active in the conservative movement for the past 5 years and has helped promote conservative ideas by serving as a local college Republican chairman and as state co-chairman of the College Republicans in Arizona. Manny recently served as a national field director for the College Republican National Committee, from which he was cordially recommended to the Leadership Institute by Scott Stewart, who recently spoke here. And there, Manny was developing and running the first minority outreach effort in the 110-year history of the College Republican National Committee. Currently, Manny serves as the Director of Public Relations for the Campus Leadership Program at LI. He grew up in San Diego and is a graduate of the University of Arizona. His family roots are in the small border town of Nogales, Arizona. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Manny is unique in another respect, and that is that he is the first person ever to be employed by the Leadership Institute for the purpose of getting program publicity for the Institute. And I want to make that very clear, because not everybody understands that. I believe that we are probably the only conservative organization of our size which has not historically sought to maximize its news coverage. We are well known among conservatives, and particularly among our donors whom we can communicate with directly. But we do not go out and seek publicity for our programs, and probably in the whole history of the organization prior to the middle of last year, we hadn't issued more than 5 or 6 news releases, and they were not news releases announcing our programs. We have an open admissions policy. Anybody who wishes can apply to and will be accepted for our schools, but our purpose is to maximize the number of effective conservative activists in the country, and our strategy is to identify people who are already conservative and to teach them how to be more effective, how to organize, communicate, raise funds, run for office, get on the media, get into public service in one way or another. and it's no part of my purpose, nor do I believe it is the purpose of any donor in this room or any of our many thousands of donors outside of here, to seek out socialists to make them more effective in the public policy process. And therefore, we communicate about our schools through conservative channels. And most of our students come to us from recommendations from our past graduates. Another major source of our students is recommendations from the donors of the Leadership Institute. And finally, the heads of conservative organizations and elected officials who hire conservatives send them to us to be trained, and that's what we've done. Campus Leadership Program, which Manny is in charge of publicizing, is a different sort of program, and it is my intention to maximize within the resources available for the purpose the coverage that we get for the Campus Leadership Program, because the left is not going to benefit particularly from knowing that we are out there organizing campuses. The left is highly organized on almost every campus in America, and certainly all of the big and famous ones have multiple left-wing organizations. The campus left is not going to benefit much from knowing that we're training people to put out independent conservative campus newspapers, because the left controls almost all of the official campus newspapers and almost all of the journalism schools in the United States. So in these two areas, things that are going on actively on campus, we do not mind and in fact are encouraging publicity. And it isn't easy to get publicity because there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of organizations out there trying to get publicity. But I decided that we're going to do it, and we're going to do it because our programs will benefit from this publicity. Conservative students around the country will learn more easily and better that we have things to offer them, and that if they want to be active for conservative principles on their campuses, the place to come to learn how to be effective is the Leadership Institute. And so that is why I present to you the first PR agent for the Leadership Institute, Manny Espinosa.
Thank you, Morton, and thank you all for being here this morning. I'm just going to give you a brief update on what we're doing at CLP. I'm not going to take too long, but I wanted to let you know, like Morton said, what we do is we help start campus groups. We help identify and make active conservatives on college campuses. Currently, we have 251 active organizations that span over 42 states. Just a couple things that are going on with the Campus Leadership Program. Recently, at the University of Richmond in Richmond, Virginia, we had an amazing event that took place there. Our Campus Leadership Program there wanted to speak out against affirmative action, so they decided to do it through selling cookies. Now what they did is they held an affirmative action bake sale. During this bake sale, they sold cookies to people at different prices depending on the race of the person. Needless to say, this raised some eyebrows. And needless to say, this angered the administration and a lot of the liberal groups on campus. We got lots of earned media for that. We were on a couple TV stations, and we were in a couple newspapers, including the largest newspaper in Richmond, the Richmond Times-Dispatch, in which a reporter wrote a less than supportive article of us, which was great advertising for us because conservatives got even more upset and wanted to get more involved. Well, now these affirmative action bake sales have spread all across the country. Another CLP group started one at the University of Michigan, where the Supreme Court case is going to be argued from. So that is what's going on with the affirmative action bake sales. I'm sure you'll be hearing more about them. I am in the process of helping some students from the University of California, Berkeley get some national coverage for their affirmative action bake sale, which was held last week. This year, the Youth Leadership School, which is run by the Campus Leadership Program, has trained more than 200 students. I actually just participated in one of the Youth Leadership Schools. I helped to teach down in Phoenix, Arizona, and it was a great showing, and we had a great time down in Phoenix this past weekend. The Bucknell Conservatives Club, the CLP group from Bucknell in Pennsylvania, will be featured in about 3 weeks in a large article, rather large article, I understand, in the New York Times Magazine. This is going to be some great advertising for the Campus Leadership Program and the Leadership Institute. And our main goal here is we want students contacting us, asking us to help them set up conservative groups. So this is going to be some amazing coverage. We are also in the process of something which you will probably hear about in the next couple of months, and we are involved with numerous other organizations to help bring an end to campus speech codes. So you'll be hearing about that. Look for that in the news. One last thing. Today at 2 p.m., the Campus Leadership Program is going to be sponsoring a protest down at the French Embassy. So you may want to watch the evening news tonight for that. Thank you all for your time, and thank you for being here this morning.
Thanks, Manny. You're doing a great job. And now, to introduce our speaker, I'm going to present Sarah Henry of our staff. She hails from Memphis, Tennessee, where she entered Rhodes College as a National Merit Finalist and graduated in 2001 with a bachelor's degree in political science. Since February of 2002, she has served as the events coordinator for the Leadership Institute's Campus Leadership Program. In this capacity, she assists conservative college students in bringing speakers to their campuses. Recently, Campus Leadership Program groups have hosted luminaries such as Ann Coulter, Dinesh D'Souza, and John Stossel. Sarah also organizes the Institute's Youth Leadership School, which is our flagship school, which is designed to instruct college students in the fundamentals of effective political activism. In her spare time, Sarah has worked on a number of political campaigns and has written articles for the Weekly Standard, for the Intercollegiate Studies Institute's American Conservatism and Encyclopedia. Additionally, she composed the bibliography for a soon-to-be-published anthology of religious mysteries, God and the Detectives. Sarah plans to begin graduate work in political theory this fall at the University of Virginia. Sarah?
This month's breakfast comes at a particularly important time in the national debate over affirmative action in higher education. April 1st, the Supreme Court will hear oral arguments on 2 cases fresh out of the University of Michigan involving racial preferences in the college admissions process. The court's decision may have the impact that Bakke did in 1978 and will certainly affect the public discourse on the subject for years to come. Here to weigh in on that debate is Terry Eastland, publisher of the Weekly Standard magazine. Terry's a graduate of Vanderbilt and Oxford universities. He's worked in journalism for a number of years and for a number of publications, and has served as a resident scholar at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., as well as Director of Public Affairs for the Justice Department. He's been with the Weekly Standard since 2001. Mr. Eastland is the author or editor of 7 books, including Ending Affirmative Action, The Case for Colorblind Justice, and Freedom of Expression in the Supreme Court. He's contributed to, among other publications, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Washington Times, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, Commentary, and the Public Interest. Since January 2001, he's also written a weekly column for the Dallas Morning News. Please join me in welcoming Terry Eastland to the Leadership Institute.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for having me. And I hope people can hear my voice. I have a soft voice. Can you hear me back there? Back? Fine. Can you hear me? Good. Morton, thank you very much for your generosity. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's good to see Eugene as well. And I'm sorry, Helen. Apologize. The last time I was here, must have been about 1998, and I heard Chris Matthews give a talk. And Chris talks so fast that it was almost a blur for me that morning. You know, and when you do radio and television commentaries, you're supposed to do a set number of words according to how fast you can speak them or how slowly you can speak them. And I think in a minute's time, Chris could probably easily say 250 or maybe 300 words. Whereas when I do it, it's about 160. So in any event, those of you preparing to be broadcasters or in broadcast school should study Chris Matthews. You can get more said, I guess. Let's hope it's more. and a length of time. I suppose this morning I should be up here talking about how to conduct a bake sale. Maybe recommend the ingredients necessary to make the cookies that would be just right that you could sell for different prices according to race and ethnicity. Manny's report told me something I didn't know, which was that this started at University of Richmond. I had seen the account of the story at Michigan and wondered how it did get started. The interesting thing about the whole affirmative action debate, I think, was crystallized in a recent letter to the New York Times, where the letter writer said that we would have clarity on this issue if instead of adding points to an applicant's record, that instead points were subtracted according to race, so that those who might be white or those who might be Asian American, for example, were the ones whose scores were cut back. And that if this were to happen, we would have clarity about what is happening on this debate. That would be an interesting phenomenon to see. Suddenly the universities and the graduate schools in this country start assigning benefits by subtracting points from the scores of those who apply. I also work with Sarah's sister, Beth. Where's Beth? Who is also known to some of you. Beth is at the Weekly Standard. And Sarah has contributed to the Weekly Standard. The Weekly Standard, in case, does everyone here know the Weekly Standard? I have to understand, as a publisher, I'm an apostle of this magazine everywhere I go. And so I can't not get up and talk to you about it without mentioning it. The Weekly Standard has been distributed, I think, around the building. This is a recent copy of The Liberator, George Bush, if you will, as we anticipate what may happen, what will happen, I'm sure, in Iraq. Normally, when someone from the Weekly Standard goes to speak someplace, that representative is expected to talk about Iraq. But this morning I'm not going to do that. But I will say this. I have a special offer for those associated with the Leadership Institute. If you would like to take our magazine, if you do not yet know it, I'm prepared to offer you, I feel like I'm selling not cookies, but I'm prepared to offer you at a very low rate a full year, 48 issues. We publish 48 issues a year. And we have a special, actually, student rate of $39 for the year. So that's as good as you're going to get this magazine anywhere. And whatever one's age, whether one is in college or not, one is eligible for that. Let me tell you how to get it. If you want to do this, go online to weeklystandard.com, type in a slash. You all know how to do this? Type in a slash and type in LI, that stands for Leadership Institute. And there will be a page that pops up where you can place an order on these terms, 48 issues for $39 for the Weekly Standard. So I obviously am encouraging any and all of you to take advantage of this great offer. As I said, it's a student offer, but we offer this to everyone here today and anyone else who might be associated with the Leadership Institute. The Michigan cases. What are these cases? Why are they important? What is the administration's position in these cases? What is the likely outcome of the Supreme Court? These are a lot of subjects, and I'll try to cover them rapidly here this morning and then throw this open to questions. The Michigan cases actually are, the reason they're called the cases, they're two cases. The cases involve the undergraduate school at the University of Michigan and also the law school. And in both cases, there were individuals, applicants to the respective schools, who failed to be admitted to the schools. And when they learned that there were, in fact, racially and ethnically preferential programs being run at the admissions office, they decided to challenge these programs on constitutional and federal statutory grounds. And so the two cases started moving through the court system some years ago. It takes many, many years for these cases to get to the point where they are today in the Supreme Court. But basically, as Sarah told us in her introduction, these cases are follow-ons, if you will, to the landmark Bakke case, which was decided, it will have been 25 years ago this June by the Supreme Court. In the Bakke case, the court reviewed an issue that arose from the University of California Davis Medical School, where that medical school had reserved 16 out of 100 seats for certain officially designated minority members. So there was an actual quota that was set up by the Davis Medical School, and that quota was challenged by a man named Alan Bakke. who was not admitted to that school. He was rejected. And his grade point average and his MCAT scores that he wanted to be a doctor were substantially higher, in fact, than those who had been specially admitted through the quota program. He challenged, he lost his case at one stage, but in the Supreme Court ordered him to be admitted, and it struck down the quota, the 16-seat set-aside, if you will. It struck it down. The interesting thing about the decision, though, was that Justice Powell, no longer on the court, as you all know, that Justice Powell wrote the swing opinion in that case in which he said, look, race may nonetheless be taken into account. You can't have quotas, but a university or a graduate school may take race into account. It may be one among other factors that a university might consider in admitting students. And of course, this is the Powell opinion that has shaped and influenced higher education ever since. And so we have schools all over the country that have tried to follow some form of what Justice Powell wrote in their admissions procedures. The University of Texas, Beth went to the University of Texas. The University of Texas had an interesting case a few years ago called the Hopwood case, where in fact there was a challenge to the University of Texas Law School's admissions program. And that case never made it to the Supreme Court. It got to the Fifth Circuit, and it was decided there, and in fact it was decided against the University of Texas. We've been waiting for some years. I've been waiting. Many of us who follow this issue have been waiting for a case to get to the Supreme Court, and finally, after a number of cases came up through the circuit courts, we do have these cases from Michigan from the Sixth Circuit. There was a case that challenged the University of Georgia's admissions program a few years ago, and it was resolved about a year and a half ago against the University of Georgia. It was running an unconstitutional admissions policy that used race and ethnicity. There was also a case from the University of Washington challenging the law school. Now, the state of Washington adopted actually by an amendment to their constitution which denied that universities may take race into account. Likewise, California, the state of California, those of you familiar with California know that California passed Proposition 209, which denies the use of race across the board, but specifically in the context of higher education, it made it off limits to Berkeley and all the other institutions there of higher learning in California. But as I say, at some point there was bound to be a case that would make its way to the Supreme Court, and so we have the Michigan cases. I think their importance is substantial, but it will depend upon how the court decides these particular cases. The way the court has looked at these cases, and here, if you'll permit me, I'm going to engage in a little bit of law speak. Edmund Burke once said, "The study of law sharpens the intellect by narrowing the mind," and so it is. The difficulty, though, is you can't really talk about these cases without repairing to some of the legal terms. The issue that is before the court is this. In constitutional terms, we have the 14th Amendment. We know that there is an equal protection guarantee in the 14th Amendment. And we know that what the court has said about that particular provision is this, that a government, in this case the University of Michigan, because it's an agency of the state, a government has to have, according to the court, a very, very good reason for taking race into account if it's going to do that. And if it does take race into account, then it must have make sure that it is very narrowly tailored. That's the legal term. What that means is you need to exhaust other alternatives. You need to make very sure that you have to resort to race to achieve the particular goal you might have in mind. The legal jargon for this is what is called strict scrutiny in constitutional terms. You'll hear lawyers talk about compelling interest. What is a compelling interest? And the University of Michigan says that its compelling interest is what it calls diversity. It seeks to have a diverse class, meaning educationally diverse, but one element of an educationally diverse student body is race and ethnicity. And so it wants to select students so that it creates such a body, and it believes that within such a student body, within such a class, that this might be an atmosphere in which there's greater learning for everyone, regardless of of race, if you will, or ethnicity, that this will only contribute to the learning experience on the campus. Now, this was the original rationale, by the way, articulated by Justice Powell in the Bakke case. He was the only justice who acknowledged this rationale for using race or ethnicity in college and in graduate school admissions. But it's become the rationale used throughout higher education. The one thing you do not hear higher educators say is that we've got to use these devices to admit students because we've been guilty of discrimination against these particular groups. They don't really say that. Said, because that's not too flattering if they were to say that. And of course, in many cases, it's not true. Historically, there were some cases like that, obviously. But it's not true anymore, and so the rationale that they all repair to is the diversity rationale. There's an interesting exercise. I don't recommend anyone go through this, but if you want to pull all the briefs, all the friend of the court briefs that have been filed in the Michigan case, there are, I think, more than 80 of them now. And the huge, the largest number of these briefs have been entered on the side of Michigan. And these briefs are full of colleges and universities throughout the country that support the Michigan programs. It is very difficult to find, outside of maybe Hillsdale College, Grove City, and a few others, it's very difficult these days to find at least a selective institution that does not count and allocate benefits by race and ethnicity at the admissions office. So we have these cases. They're before the court. The question the court has to decide is whether indeed diversity is a rationale that meets constitutional muster. And the court is going to have to, I think, revisit the Bakke case, and in particular Justice Powell's opinion of 25 years ago in deciding this case. The courts of appeals below, as the lawyers say, are divided on this issue. We have different rulings from different circuit courts of appeals regarding the question of diversity. The Bush administration had to decide what it wanted to do in this case by the middle of January. And as we probably all in this room know, the administration did file a brief, and it did come out in favor of those who were challenging the two particular programs. The interesting question, though, here is what the nature of the argument was by the Bush administration. And Ted Olson, the Solicitor General, filed an amicus brief which basically bypassed this whole question of diversity. Is diversity a compelling interest in constitutional law? He did not address that question. Now, in my view, and this is a problem with the brief, in my view, the court took this case to decide that issue. And for the Solicitor General not to file in that case, it seems to me, is a mistake, because the court typically does not pay much attention to the filings by these interested parties who are not the original parties in the case. They skip past a lot of the stuff that's, a lot of the blather, frankly, that is filed. I doubt that Justice Scalia wastes much time reading it. But they do pay attention to what the government says. The United States government has enormous stature with the court. At least it usually does. Sometimes it varies according to the administration. But Ted Olson is a figure who is highly respected in the Supreme Court. Yet he has filed a brief here for the government in which he takes a pass on what I think is the critical issue before the court. So the court will not get the advice of the government as to whether or not diversity is a compelling interest in constitutional law. What the administration instead did, what Ted Olson did say, was that these particular programs, in the way that they use race, these programs are not narrowly tailored, again to use that jargon, to accomplish the end that the University of Michigan declares. The brief says, look, the two programs effectively engage in quotas. And we know from the Bakke case that quotas are unconstitutional. They're unlawful. So you can't engage in quotas. There will be a debate in the court over that, over whether, in fact, the way in which the law school and the undergraduate school have counted by race, whether that amounts to a quota. I think you can make a reasonable case that these are quotas. Ted Olson has also argued that the University of Michigan, both the undergraduate and the law school, simply resorted to these numerical devices, that they simply started according individuals 20 points automatically, for example, because of race in the admissions process, that they started doing this without considering race-neutral alternatives. In other words, is there a race-neutral way to achieve your goals? That's the question is before the court and that Ted Olson is pressed. And it may well be that the court will decide the case as Ted Olson has invited the court to decide it. The court could say, okay, look, we're not going to reach this whole question about diversity. We're going to say instead that Michigan has quotas, and quotas are really, as we know, in violation of what we have held in previous cases. We also know that Michigan has not looked around for a race-neutral alternative. It has not done, for example, what the University of Texas is now doing. The University of Texas, you probably read about it, has a 10% plan, whereby the top 10% of the students graduating from any high school in the state are eligible for entry to the University of Texas and the other leading institutions in the state. What that means, of course, is that if you go to a particularly weak school academically, the top 10%, you might have individuals in that top 10% who have grade point averages or at least SAT scores that are much lower than someone at a much more competitive school who might be in the top half. So there are some problems with that, but the court might look at this case and say, look, Michigan could at least try that before it gets into this kind of retail exercise of allocating points according to race and ethnicity. But by the way, the three groups that Michigan has designated for preference are blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans. Asian Americans are not included in this group. Neither are many other groups, by the way. But those are the three that Michigan has focused on. And that is a trio, if you will, that is generally found in most institutions of higher education. Those are the three groups. The court, as I say, has before it this question of diversity and this question of narrow tailoring. Now, I will give you this for the administration's brief, and I've thought more about the brief. Sometimes you will criticize things in print, and then you will think about them later on, and I have certainly been highly critical of the administration's brief. In thinking about this issue some more, it could well be that Ted Olson is even smarter than I thought originally. By skipping past the diversity rationale, by focusing so much on the use of race and whether that's constitutional, he may be inviting the court to abandon its theoretical framework, its doctrine, the doctrine that it's used to decide these cases. He could be inviting it just to say, look, you need to ask whether it truly furthers the goal of the equal protection of the law simply to engage in race and race counting. That gets you past the whole diversity rationale. It gets you past any rationale. It more or less says no rationale is important. The only interesting question is whether this really furthers the goal of the Equal Protection Clause. I will be therefore interested to see on April 1. I can't imagine that they're going to argue this case on April 1st, but they're going to do so. Maybe this is Justice Scalia's wit being displayed, but in any event, it will be interesting to see if Ted Olson, who has asked for argument time, gets a question in which he pursues this line of argument, because this would be a change in the way the court has approached these kinds of cases. The court has a very, in my view, complicated doctrinal approach to these cases. And in a way, Ted Olson's brief is an invitation, a subtle one, I guess, so subtle that I only now have thought of it in the last couple of weeks, that it might be an invitation for it to go about this in another way. But what will the court do? Getting to the last question. The court, in my view, is going to strike down the Michigan programs. I think there's probably at least 5 votes for that. There may be 6. I even hold out hope for Justices Ginsburg and Breyer, who have expressed interest in issues of equality, and perhaps they may see the numerical devices that the way in which race is counted and the way in which race is counted to achieve certain numerical outcomes. They may find that offensive to the Equal Protection Clause. Wouldn't hold out a great deal of hope, but I hold out some for them. So that's what I think will happen, but of course the wild card in this is a justice by the name of Sandra Day O'Connor. And while she has written the leading cases on affirmative action for the court and generally written some pretty good opinions, She always is a justice who is right in the middle, a justice who is going to decide a case on the narrowest ground possible. Sandra Day O'Connor and Justice Scalia are as divergent on this as one can imagine. Justice O'Connor wants to retain discretion to decide the next case. That's why she decides it so narrowly. We've all had that experience, haven't we? We want to decide an issue so narrowly in our own lives so we can retain some discretion, decide something else that might come along. We don't want to issue any kind of rules that might cover all cases at once. Whereas Scalia wants to supply us with a rule that will decide cases and get these things out of the court. Scalia, I doubt, will triumph in this particular case. But O'Connor is the one to watch, and my guess is she will take a very narrow approach. The key question is whether she might embrace the diversity rationale. I think there are 4 justices who would reject the diversity rationale. The question is whether O'Connor would join that and make it 5. It's always possible, though, for her to embrace the diversity rationale and, again, still find that the Michigan use of race is not narrowly tailored. So there could be 5 votes that way. The interesting aspect of this case is a particular piece of law that I've not mentioned, and that is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act is a piece of law that says basically if you are a recipient of federal money, and in this case if you're an institution of higher education, and by the way, unless you're Hillsdale, all of the institutions of higher education in the country receive federal money, so they are obligated by Title VI. And Title VI says if you're a recipient of federal funds that you cannot in any way exclude or limit or otherwise deny participation to someone in a discriminatory fashion based on race, ethnicity, sex, and so forth. That is very clear-cut law. It was, when it was enacted in 1964, it was understood to be genuinely colorblind law. It was saying no discrimination on the basis of race, none whatsoever. And what has happened in the 39 years since that particular statute was passed, we have basically turned the meaning of the statute on its head, such that that law is now no longer a colorblind law, but permits the use of color-conscious techniques on the part of those who receive federal money, such as in the admissions offices of Michigan, Texas, Virginia, you name it. I think, though, that that law is still good law in terms of what it originally meant. And it's striking that Justice Stevens, whom we think of as a liberal justice, that Justice Stevens in the 1978 Bakke case wrote a separate opinion based on Title VI in which he said, hey, look, what the University of California Medical School is doing is at odds with Title VI. Nothing could be clearer. Now, he's written some opinions since then that give me some doubt as to whether he would embrace what he wrote in 1978, but he was right. And I think if the court were to be confronted with the true meaning of Title VI, it could not do otherwise than to embrace a colorblind meaning and to find the Michigan program at odds with that particular statute. So I would say that Title VI is the wild card in this case. The court generally likes to decide cases on statutory grounds instead of reaching constitutional grounds if we can do so. And Title VI would give them that opportunity. But as I say, the big issue in the law has been this question of diversity. Is that a suitable rationale in the Constitution? Let me just say one thing, or two things actually, about the diversity rationale. Here's the problem with it. Diversity is a rationale which treats individuals as fungible members of their racial and ethnic groups. It does not see people as individuals for who they might be. It simply looks at the group and says, hey, we need one of these or one of these, and it assumes that because someone is of a particular group, that that person has something to contribute that is somehow distinctive to that group. This, of course, is, interestingly enough, what the Civil Rights Movement in its best impulses fought against, was this very understanding, this group understanding. That's one reason why diversity is a flawed rationale. It contradicts the very best understanding, I think, of what it would mean to be an American and how we as Americans ought to regard one another. And that is my fundamental objection, by the way, to these procedures in the admissions offices. The second thing about diversity, as soon as this passes, the second thing about diversity that's important to know is this. If the court were to embrace the diversity rationale, the problem with it is this. It has no limit. It has no end. It is a recipe for ongoing discrimination, discrimination without any limit. And why do I say that? I say that because of this reason. When affirmative action programs were first introduced in the middle 1960s to the late 1960s, this was the argument. The argument was, look, we need these devices in employment, in higher education admissions, and in contracting. Those are the three areas in which they first appeared. We need to be able to count by race in order to remedy the historic discrimination that has been endured by black Americans. That was the argument. It was a remedial argument. If you think about a remedial argument, the nature of that argument is this. You take the medicine, at some point there's a cure. There is a limit to a remedy. A remedy is not perpetual, it's not forever. And the original arguments for affirmative action were all of that kind. They were that this is but a temporary device. Temporary. Of course, here we are, what is it, 35, 38 years later, and it's still supposedly temporary. But, of course, what has happened over the years is that those who have supported these programs have had to find a rationale that would enable the programs to survive, if you will, in an ongoing fashion, and diversity provides that. It provides that because, look, America, by the Declaration of Independence, is at least in theory was going to be a multi-racial, ethnic. It was almost anyone in the world, everyone in the world could be eligible, if you will, to be an American. That's what the promise of America was, and so it has become. The melting pot, we can go through all the idioms and so forth that have been used to describe this. So, when you look at that fact, when you look at the fact that our population is constantly changing by factors of immigration, by factors of birth, we're going to have a constantly remade country, if you will. And so the percentages of us who are of this race or of this ethnicity, we're constantly going to be changing, aren't we? And so if we need to make sure that we have adequate diversity in our institutions, then we're always going to be fooling with these percentages in a way to get the right diversity that maybe represents the mix of America. There's no reason that the diversity rationale can ever be put on the shelf, so to speak. It will always have to be there. And so there will always be the possibility of discriminating against someone who lacks the sufficient skin color or ethnicity to enable you to have the diversity that you think you need. So that is the essential problem with that kind of approach. Diversity treats people, well, not as individuals, but as, again, fungible members of their particular groups, and then it also launches us into if you will, a perpetual discriminatory mode. Now, the interesting thing about that is this. Discrimination or diversity is a rationale for discriminating against those who were the, if you will, original affirmative action class. In other words, diversity can be used to discriminate against blacks, against Hispanics, against anyone that someone deems is not useful for diversity purposes. Now, if you think I'm joking about this, I'm not. There was a case that came up during the Clinton administration out of Piscataway, New Jersey. And the case involved a couple of school teachers. One happened to be black, one happened to be white. They were apparently equally qualified on the merits. Piscataway had to lay off a teacher at this point for budgetary purposes, and so they had to decide between these two teachers which one it should be. And the white teacher was the one laid off. The school system followed a diversity plan in order to make that decision. Anyway, the case went through the courts, came up to the Supreme Court. The Clinton administration had sided with the school board's diversity rationale, by the way. And Bill Clinton, when he was asked about the case, he said this. He said, look, I'm for this diversity rationale so long as it cuts both ways. For example, if you had the black teacher and the white teacher, but you had too many black teachers in the school, you could have let the black teacher go in order to get the adequate diversity that the school needed. And so we can see how this can become what? An equal opportunity discriminator at the end of the day. It can be used against those who were originally thought to be the ones to be protected in affirmative action programs. Well, that is my worry about the Michigan cases. If they were to be decided against those who challenged them, if they were to be decided in favor of Michigan, particularly if the court were to embrace the diversity rationale, I would say that we would be then facing a country in which many institutions already committed to what I think is a pernicious doctrine would pursue that doctrine with great zeal, and we would see discrimination on and on in an enduring fashion, and even against individuals from those groups who were and are now still, in many cases, affirmative action eligible, if you will. Let me, with that somber note, throw this open to some questions on the Michigan cases. Sure.
How do they, the other side, how do they defend what they believe in Asian? Essentially, they're discriminating heavily against the doctors in California that they eliminated here.
Right.
So how do they, what kind of possible rationale is there to defend that?
They have no rationale. The truth of the matter is Asians are just too smart. You know, I mean that's. I mean, I guess that's what they. I mean, the truth is that in the original Bakke case, this is interesting. When the University of California, Davis created its 16-seat set-aside, it included Asian Americans among those that it wanted to admit through affirmative action. And it may have done that just because they thought perhaps they quote needed it, but it transpired very quickly that in terms of GPA and MCAT scores and in the other contexts, LSATs and anything else you look at, it made absolutely no sense just when the administrators looked at the numbers. They really have no good rationale, and it is the case. It is the case that Asian Americans historically can cite discrimination. I mean, they can cite their own history in this country. Of course, the other problem with that is that there are a great many, and this is the other problem with affirmative action, is that the impact of immigration since the 1960s upon this whole question. And why is it that someone who's come to America in the 1970s or 1980s should somehow benefit from the historic discrimination against that person's racial group, 100 years back? I mean, that's another problem with it. And there's been a substantial influx of Asian Americans. That's why it's relevant here. Also Hispanics in the last 30 years. Sorry. Yeah, sorry.
Could you repeat the question because we don't know what the person.
I'm sorry. The question was simply regarding Asians and how Asians are, why it is that, or how it is that universities rationalize the discrimination against Asians. And the answer, I think, is that I was just saying that Asian Americans were originally included in the first affirmative action plan in the Bakke case out of California, but very quickly schools came to realize that by virtue of their test scores and MCAT scores and LSAT scores, that they were at the top of the charts, and there was no reason, if you will, in practical terms, to include them in these plans. They have no defense now, other than they would just say, look, we don't have to give these people any extra help. They're already doing well. They're just too smart, as I was jokingly saying earlier.
The student doesn't have the particular intellectual skill set necessary to do well, say, in a top school. How are they really helped by being admitted?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think these programs do more to make the administrators feel good than anything else. I mean, that's what they think. That's their good deed, if you will. Thomas Sowell, I think, has written persuasively on the phenomenon of mismatching. What he has said is that, look, we have students who are not unqualified in any sense. They're just not as well qualified as the group that is applying, say, to Harvard, and they get into Harvard when they should, in fact, be going to perhaps still a good school, maybe a school in state, say if they're in Virginia, University of Virginia. There are people who get into Virginia but they don't get into Harvard, as we know. Or maybe someone who is, again, not absolutely unqualified, but who is not qualified in a competitive sense to get into UVA, but could perhaps go to James Madison, and on and on and on. The truth of the matter, at least at the undergraduate level, is that there are so many points of entry for students in this country that there is a college for someone somewhere to start out at, and there is also movement up, as we know. Once people have demonstrated their abilities at one level, people can move to another level. Tom Sowell, in fact, in his autobiography, was writing about this very phenomenon in his case when he moved from Howard to Harvard.
As an educator, I am concerned. We have young people here this morning. These are our future leaders. Are we confusing them? They represent schools where the same program has been in operation. We need statesmen. Early in our country, we had people coming from Europe. We did not call them Polish Americans. They were Americans of Polish origin, Americans of German origin. I think we need to have an attitude of good citizenship, patriotism, qualified teachers who are willing to teach, instead of building people who want to be in those eye brackets. And I think this is a course that we should spend more time on. But the diversity has created more problems in education, poorer education, and we have maintained educators who are not qualified and are not educating our youth. Will you address it?
Well, there's a lot packed into that. I mean, I would just say that.
I always do.
All right. Many good points. Your statement reminds me of something Justice Scalia said in one of his opinions in an affirmative action case a few years ago. He said that we are all one race here, and it's American. And he was trying to reject this notion of the hyphenated Americans, that the diversity mongering is encouraged.
Where did it start?
Well, I think there always have been. I mean, you can go back into the 19th and certainly into the 18th century. I mean, there've been groups that have congregated, lived together, in, if you will, an ethnic setting, and wanted to identify. Well, I know, but I'm just saying that you can trace it back. I think the politicized use is what you're speaking to. In other words, the notion that, look, because we are of this hyphenated American community, therefore we need to have some kind of benefits given us specially by the government. Now that is a much newer phenomenon.
Can you please say a word or two about the practical way in which even the Texas program has the practical effect of advancing students with lower test scores by the kind of geographic discrimination against it? It's not a pure merit system.
Oh, no, it contravenes merit, and that's the problem with it. The Texas system, which I referred to earlier, and you've gone over it now, the Texas system, I think, actually could be vulnerable to a legal challenge on what are called disparate impact grounds in the law, because clearly the intention of the program is to get the same results, and it has race and ethnicity in mind. I wonder if there will ever be a plaintiff willing to challenge it. I would say this: it's a better system than the one it replaced, but it is still one that violates merit.
Let's take one more.
It is, incidentally, I will say this: it is one that the Bush administration has held up, has lauded. You know, the president himself has supported it. And in the brief that the Solicitor General filed, he referred to it and held it up as a model. There is a real problem. If I'm on the other side in this case, I point to this and I say, look, this has no relevance to professional schools and graduate schools. This only could work if it works in an undergraduate context out of high schools. I mean, how are you going to go around and get a top 10% plan working at that kind of level? Plus, if I'm at Harvard, if I'm at Princeton, if I'm at Washington and Lee, I look at this and I say, this has no bearing on private schools. I mean, private schools get their applicants from all over. One other question.
If you were a betting man, what would you say realistically are the odds that the Supreme Court will actually strike down the University of Michigan affirmative action admission program?
I think they're very strong, but I think it might be narrow, 5-4. and it might not strike down, the court might not strike down the diversity rationale, which I think is the key issue in the case. Look, here's the problem. In the 1978 Bakke case, the court struck down a quota plan, but still said that universities may take race into account in selecting the classes that they enroll. And the president at that time of the University of California, David Saxon, said, look, this is not such a bad thing. We can get around this. We can still achieve the same ends we want. And he was right. It's quite possible for the court to strike down quotas and not reach the question of whether a university may take race into account or may use race, as the formula goes, as one factor. And by the way, that's the issue that Condi Rice spoke to that Ted Olson did not speak to. Condoleezza Rice came out and said, by the way, this is what I think. Sure, these institutions of higher education may take race into account. I mean, that is the bottom line issue in this case, and the government's brief avoided it totally. And so the question for me, and I think the question for all of us here, is whether the court will reach these questions. Because to cut it off is not necessarily to kill it, if you will. Thank you. Now, if anyone forgot how to order the Weekly Standard, you can come see me later on.
Thank you very much, Terry. It was a very interesting presentation and very timely. We really appreciate your taking time out to join us here for the Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast, and as a token of appreciation for your effort and remembrance of our visit, we're happy to present you with the Leadership Institute Adam Smith necktie.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Morton.
Thank you. A couple of announcements. One, which was passed to me by the lady sitting beside me, an announcement that she wishes me to make, which I am very delighted to make. Eagle Forum's founder and president, Phyllis Schlafly, will be speaking to students this evening at George Washington University in D.C. On the topic of feminism versus conservatism. And you know Phyllis's campus appearances are always very exciting. It's going to be at 7:30 p.m. at the Marvin Center, and you can get there by taking the Metro because parking is notoriously bad around GMU. You can get off at Foggy Bottom, GWU, exit, turn right, and the Marvin Center is the second building on your right, entrance on 21st Street. Our guests who are here for the first time or haven't been here in a while, if you would like a tour of the building, please meet at the podium at the conclusion of the breakfast. The tour will depart immediately after we see an adjournment, which is right close here, and Emily Geisler, who's an intern, that is she, is going to take you on the tour, and I invite you all to join us on Wednesday, April 2nd, where we will not be able to productively give an Adam Smith necktie to our guest, because our special guest is going to be Tucker Carlson, co-host of CNN's Crossfire, and as we all know, he only wears bow ties. Hope to see you again soon. Thank you.